The secrets of grief. What are they? What do you wish people knew about your grief? What about the expectations that others have of you, or the expectations you have of yourself in your grief journey? Are they realistic? What is absent grief, and how does that affect your journey? That's where we will be spending our time today. If you have someone in your life that you want to teach how to help you grieve, and it's too exhausting to spell it out for them, this would be a good episode to share.
Are you lost in the chaos of grief, struggling to find your way in the darkness? Are you asking yourself, will I ever be able to enjoy life again? Are you wondering where God is right now? Welcome to the Grief Mentor Show. This podcast is a safe place for you. It will shine a light into the shadows, helping you discover that joy and pain can coexist, that you still have purpose, and there is a path to peace. Hello, friend. I'm Teresa Davis. I, too, was lost in the chaos of grief the day my son died. Just like you, I longed for peace in this unfamiliar world. I longed for the weight crushing my chest to be lifted so I could breathe. I clung tightly to the anchor, and it was there that I discovered the tools I needed to navigate life after loss. And I'm ready to help you do the same. If you're ready, I'm holding my hand out to you, friend. Let me show you the way, one step at a time.
What does it look like to work with me, the Grief Mentor? You visit my Work With Me page, watch the video there that explains what I have to offer you in my perspective, book your call, answer a few questions about your loss, and then I go to work, creating a detailed plan for you during our 1-hour time together. This is not just a time for you to tell me about your loss, although you'll have plenty of time to do that, but it's also a time that we will work through your personal story of loss to develop a plan for you to see a way forward. Maybe that's helping you reframe your thoughts or learning to manage those special dreaded days like the first anniversary of your child's death. Or maybe you just need help managing the spiritual side of your child's death. Maybe you're completely lost in the chaos of grief and you have no idea where to start and you need help finding clarity and a way to process your grief and live your life. If you're ready, I'm here for you, friend. In the last Q&A session, I started off the discussion with this question. What do you wish people knew about your grief? I'm going to share some of their answers with you, as well as some answers to that question from other folks that have shared their thoughts with me through the years, because the secrets of grief are not really secrets at all. It's what we want people to know about our grief, but either we just don't have the words to express it, or we're just simply too exhausted to tell them how we feel. There's this feeling that lingers, that there's no way you can understand unless you've lost a child as well. That's why it's so comforting to be with people who understand this pain. And the next live Q&A is April 18th. If you're not a Grief Mentor Insider, go to the link in the show notes or to my website, thegriefmentor.com, and join today. If you're already a Grief Mentor Insider, follow the directions in the newsletter to submit your question, or just click the box if you're not ready to ask a question and you just want to attend. We get it. You are welcome here. I'm going to share with you 10 things that has been shared with me from people whom I've asked, what do you wish people knew about your grief? Number 1, for people to stop asking me how I am. I am as good as you would be if you lost your child. Number 2, I wish people knew that saying my son's name is a gift to me. It's nothing to be afraid of. Number 3, time stood still that day, and now I have no concept of time passing. Number 4, I would love to hear my son's name more often, and I would love to talk about him. Number 5, my grief never ends, yet people look at me expecting me to reach a place where, quote, I'm over it. They want the same person I used to be, but that person is gone forever. 6, even with the best support, Grief is incredibly lonely and isolating. 7, there is so much guilt associated with moving forward. Number 8, grief isn't just mourning the loss of a person, it's also mourning the past, present, and future versions of myself. Number 9, grief changes all your relationships because the lens that I view life from now will never be the same. Number 10, saying their name will not remind me they died. It reminds me that they lived. And then I'm going to add one from my perspective. Once I was able to process my grief, I realized that it wasn't the pictures that made me feel like someone punched me in my gut and took my breath away. But it was the death of the dream that I would grow old with my son. What most people don't realize is that it's annoying for those who grieve, for others to put this arbitrary timeline on our grief. For example, some, and I might even go as far as to say many, expect those that grieve to be able to, quote, resume normal activities within a few months after the death of your child. Where does those expectations come from? We're going to cover expectations today. We're going to talk about expectations that are self-imposed, that we put on ourselves, and we're also going to speak about the expectations that others place on us. But just to bring awareness to the timelines of grief, do a quick Google search and see what you find. I was shocked that the American Cancer Society website said this: it's common for the grief process to take a year or longer. A year? Are you serious? Another website I found suggested 6 months to 2 years, as if after 2 years your grief just goes away. What my experience has been in my own personal journey and working with many others that have lost their child, we don't begin processing our grief the day our child dies. I'm going to repeat that. We do not begin processing our grief the day our child dies. If you're listening to this episode because someone you love has lost a child and you're trying to learn how to help them better, please hear this. The shock of their death prohibits us from processing anything, much less that we're going to spend the rest of our life without our children on this earth. Most child loss is sudden death. They're here today, gone tomorrow. And the part of the brain that processes facts, your cerebral cortex, knows that your child is dead. But the emotional aspect of your brain has not figured it out yet. It has not been able to connect the dots. And that process delays the actual processing of our grief. Other forms of child loss comes from like illness or cancer that may not be sudden, but nonetheless is unexpected and often brings death in a year or less. And during that year or less, you're not processing your grief. You're trying to survive and keep your child alive by making sure they have the best opportunities to survive. There's no time to process grief. That's what's so frustrating to me, and maybe you as well, that all the expectations that are placed on us as grieving parents comes from a place of having no clue what it's like to wake up one day and face the death of your child. The forever existence of knowing that as long as we draw breath on this earth, that we're going to do it without our child. Now, there are exceptions to this, and it's called absent grief. I'm going to explain this when we talk about expectations. So if this is you, I mentioned this in the opening. So if this is you, stick with me, okay? Because if you are experiencing absent grief, you're probably thinking there's something wrong with you, okay? Because you may not be experiencing the intense grief after the death of your child like I just went through. But stick with me. We're going to talk about that more in depth in a few minutes. The first place we're going to land is talking about the expectations that others place on us. Now, we've already talked about how others' expectations make us feel, but let's take it a step further. How does others' expectations affect our actions? Okay, how others' expectations affect our actions depends on one thing: the relationship of the person that is placing the expectations. Okay, let me say that again. How others' expectations affect our actions as grieving moms or dads depends on the relationship of the person that is placing the expectation. So let me just briefly say that how you manage the expectations of others depends on if they are in your inner circle or your outer circle. If you have followed my podcast, we've talked many times about boundaries. So I'm not going to go deep into the woods there, but I will link some episodes for you in the show notes if that's an area that you need more help with. But generally speaking, expectations from others can, one, intensify your grief emotions. It's important to be aware how you feel when you are with others. If you constantly feel judged, well, then it might be a good idea to take a little break from this person for a little bit. Now, that's easier done if this person is not inside your inner circle, somebody that you're doing life with. But start to pay attention to that, because how others place expectations on you can affect your ability to grieve well. And the second thing it can do is lead you to question your ability that you are doing a good job grieving, right? Because if it's somebody inside of our inner circle, we care about what they think. If they're not in your inner circle, let's just say that they are your employer and they have expectations that when you return to work, you're supposed to be the same person, providing the same level of work without consideration to what you've been through and what you're trying to manage. It's that same situation of what are the secrets of grief. It's what we know that nobody else knows unless they have walked through this road of child loss. So what do you do about it? Here is where you must learn to be your own best advocate, identifying your needs and surrounding yourself with people that understands. Okay, those people are what I call safe people. They're there for you without any kind of agendas or expectations for you to perform for them. In case of someone like your employer, it's time to have a conversation about their expectation of what you're capable of. So let's just sit here for a minute. Put yourself in their shoes, right? They do not understand child loss unless they've had a child that died. So for them to be able to just look at you and understand where you are in your grief journey and what you are capable of is really an unrealistic expectation on your part. Would you agree with that? And I know you might be thinking you don't want to have a conversation. You don't want to approach this with your employer. You can't handle that right now because you're so exhausted. And believe me, if you are just returning to work after the death of your child, your exhaustion is going to skyrocket. Being your own best advocate at this point is meeting your needs of rest. Okay, so if that means going to work and coming home and doing nothing the rest of the night, then that's what that means, okay? Identifying your needs. That is very important. But having a conversation with your employer, let me help you see this from a different perspective. It's much better to have that conversation with your employer on the front end than to wait until expectations override your ability to perform. Having that conversation, being honest and upfront, is the best path to take in helping your employer and maybe some coworkers understand what it's like to be in your shoes. You cannot assume that they are going to understand and give you the grace you need unless you vocalize your needs to them. Have the conversation. I can't imagine any employer or coworker not being able to work with you when you are being upfront and honest about what you're able to handle and what you need in the workplace environment to feel safe and be able to do your job. Now, we're going to talk about the expectations we place on ourselves. All right. This whole episode is centered around the secret of grief. It's a secret because we are the only ones that's going through it. People that are around us in our life cannot look at us and understand what we're going through. Now, we just covered expectations of others. Now, I want to sit here for a minute and let's talk about the expectations that we put on ourselves. Friend, often when I'm sitting on the other side of the screen, when I'm in a session with someone, I hear over and over self-accusations. Sometimes it's centered around all the reasons that your child died and how they would still be here. All the should haves and the could haves and the should nots come out. That's what I hear. Or sometimes I hear judgment of yourself about your grief journey and where you are and where you should be. And I hear things like, what's wrong with me? Often holding yourself to expectations that are impossible to meet. I just want to climb through that screen and put my arms around your neck and tell you that you are enough and that you're not flawed. And thinking that something is wrong with you is a lie. There are many factors that affect the way you grieve. I'm going to go through a few, just in case you have never been able to wrap your mind around the horrendous thing that you've been through. Because we are going through it, we often don't see all the layers and the intensity of it because we're just trying to survive. You're not thinking methodically about why you feel the way you feel. You're just feeling that way and you don't know what to do about it. So I want to make you self-aware of some factors that affect the way that you grieve. How your child died has a significant impact on the way you grieve. Sudden death from an accident, suicide, accidental overdose, illness. All of those significantly impact the way you process your grief. Caregiver grief. If you were your child's caregiver, especially if your child was born with special needs and you were in that role in your entire life, friend, that adds a huge layer of grief. The way we process life, our own life experiences affects our grief journey. What death means to you significantly affects your grief journey. I did a whole series on heaven, 4 episodes. If you are not sure what death means for you or your child, I highly encourage you to go catch those 4 episodes. Our cultural practices significantly affect the way we grieve. The relationship that you had with your child. We're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about absent grief, but the relationship that you have with your child significantly affects the way you grieve. You see, all of these circumstances add layers and layers and layers of grief. They can complicate our grief. They can prolong the way we grieve. They can delay grief. That's why I mentioned early on, we as grieving parents, these outlines that we can go online and read that says that your grief might last a year or a little bit longer. They have no idea that we are not even starting that grieving process till sometimes a year after our child is dead. Okay, because that first year is pure survival. It's living on adrenaline. It's living in the fight or flight like a tiger is chasing you, but there's no tiger. You can't process life when you're in that state. So we don't even necessarily begin to incorporate. We might be in counseling. We might be listening to the Grief Mentor podcast. We might be doing things that help us process our grief, reading every book you can get your hand on. Doesn't mean you're absorbing it. It doesn't mean you're at a stage in your life where you can sit down and methodically make a list of all the things you're going to add to your day. You're doing good to get out of the bed and put your clothes on. Meet your physical needs, much less process grief. Think about that for a minute. I want you to think about that when you start looking at ways to compare where you are in your grief journey and start making judgments on yourself that somehow something is wrong with you. Let's put it in perspective today. That's my goal. I'm trying to help you put in perspective, as well as others who maybe are close to you that may help you be able to grieve in this grief journey. Okay? Because they're watching that. If they're close enough to you, if they're in your inner circle, they're seeing that survival mode. You may not be able to express it, but the people in your life that are in your inner circle, they're witnessing it. I want to make sure you understand the layers upon layers upon layers that child death brings into our life. First of all, it's extremely unnatural. If you go to look at the grief scale, if you're one of these people that spend a lot of time on the Google and you're, looking at what is the worst loss, what you're going to find at the top of that scale, it used to be spouse loss was number one for many years, and now that's not the same anymore. They consider losing a spouse and child loss at the very top. Those are the losses that affect our lives the most. And as I said before, how you lose your child, death is the very basic layer. But then you start piling on all the other things that child loss brings. Then you're looking at some potentially complicated grief. So how do you measure your healing? Taking into account all the possibilities that can add all these layers and complicate your grief. I did an episode, I think it was episode 86, where we discussed the stages of grief through kind of a different set of eyes. I'll link that episode for you in the show notes too, if you think that would be helpful. But if you decide to measure your progress by going to the Google and researching what is, quote, normal in your experience of loss, or speaking to some individual that you feel like is your confidant to ask them what they think, if they haven't experienced child loss, friends, they don't have a clue. They cannot speak into your journey. As much as they love you, as much as they want to be there and to support you, they're not going with what you're going through. Okay? So going to places to compare your losses, I believe, leads to placing unrealistic expectations on yourself and how you grieve. And that actually can lead to more harm than good. Because this is why unrealistic expectations has the potential to intensify your grief. Okay, especially if it makes you feel like that in order to please everybody around you, you need to get over this grief, because guess what? They want the person back that you used to be. And we've already established that that person is gone forever. Doesn't mean that we can't learn to walk in this tension of child loss and live again. That second year is when you really start to process your grief. That's when the reality starts to set in that your child's not coming home. And you know what? Grief is not one size fits all. If you're listening to this and you're a really good friend and you've walked with somebody maybe that has lost a spouse, walking with somebody that's lost a child is a whole nother ballgame. Not putting one above the other. I'm just saying there are very different types of grief. Assuming that all grief is the same could negatively impact your grief journey. There are much different caveats that go along with child loss versus spousal loss. And I want to say something right here. Just because you don't acknowledge your grief doesn't mean it's not there. If you are fashioning your grief journey around others' expectations of you, and you are deciding, well, everybody thinks I need to be moving on. My friends are wanting me to come to the lake, and they're wanting me to laugh and talk and have a good time and do all the things that we used to do. So I'm just going to put my grief on a shelf and I'm going to live my life. Now, let me clarify that. Putting your grief on a shelf for periods of time when you have to perform, like on your job, is okay. But you don't put your grief on a shelf and leave it there and walk off and act like it never happened. That's what I'm talking about. You cannot permanently put your grief on a shelf and not acknowledge it and act like it's not there. Because guess what? It's going to be there waiting for you. And it might be years, might be months, but it might be years. And stuffing it down like that and pretending that your grief doesn't exist will only lead to heartache And then all of a sudden your life falls apart. And it might be 5 years down the road, and you're completely falling apart, and you don't even know why. Now, earlier I mentioned something called absent grief, and I want to speak about this for a moment. Absent grief is a form of grief where a person shows no signs, or maybe just a few signs of distress about the death of their child. I want to explain a few things about it. If this is you, I want you to listen closely. This can be a sign and pattern of complicated or delayed grief. But if this is you, I don't want you to automatically draw a conclusion that something's wrong with you, okay? As I've said over and over and over, there are many factors that affect our grief. Sometimes if the relationship with your child was strained due to mental illness or history of addictions, anything that's led to years and years and years of frustration, their death could actually feel like relief. And that could bring a flood of emotions that you don't know how to manage. It is thought that absent grief results from either denial or avoidance of the loss's emotional reality. So let me break this down a little bit. Circumstances that lead to absent grief. Okay, remember the explanation of absent grief was to show no or just a few signs of distress about the death of your child. So what are some circumstances that can lead to absent grief? One is anticipatory grief, where much of the grief process occurred before your child's death. Another possibility is lack of an emotional connection with your child. Now, there's no condemnation in this statement. Adult relationships can bring challenging circumstances that affect the ability to connect emotionally for the parent and the child. And it's important to point out here and to understand that grief is a very individualized process. And sometimes that comes with surprise responses. The key to this is being self-aware. Being self-aware helps to avoid the expectation trap. Now, with that said, some avoidance during grief is normal, but problems arise when avoidance becomes a person's go-to coping skills. That's what I mentioned earlier. When you decide that to put your grief on a shelf and leave it there forever, that's avoidance. And if that's your go-to coping skills, it's going to come back and revisit you. Some examples of chronic avoidance that might contribute to an absent grief response include refusing to talk about the loss or even acknowledge your grief to yourself. That's part of that avoidance. In other words, if you don't talk about it, it never happened. And here's the thing. Absent grief can show up later. All kinds of physical symptoms. If you're holding in those feelings of loss, it can take a toll on your body. It can lead to heart palpitations, insomnia, lack of sleep, fatigue, eating disorders. So if this is you and you're saying to yourself right now, I don't have any of those feelings. I don't feel like I'm repressing myself at all. I simply am not experiencing intense grief. So if this is you, I encourage you to speak to a professional, someone who is trained in this area. Because absent grief, believe it or not, is more common than you may realize. But becoming self-aware is the key here. Becoming aware of your circumstances, and that sometimes can be very difficult on your own. So if this is you and you are not experiencing intense feelings of loss, there could be reasons behind that. However, seeking someone who is an expert in this field may help you understand deeper into your absent grief, deeper into your personal circumstances. It's important to remember for every one of us that other people's experiences of loss is probably going to differ from ours. You may have some similarities, and you may be able to sit down and feel that camaraderie, but there's probably going to be some different caveats along the way. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. A lot of it has to do with how old your child was. People who lose children earlier in life, they deal with a little bit different circumstances than those of us who deal with children that we lose a little later in life. So it's important to not compare your grief journey with somebody else's. And I want to end the show today with this reassurance. I want you to listen really closely. If you're new in your grief journey, that means if you are in the first 2 years of life without your child, it does get better. This question came up during our live Q&A. When does the surreal disbelief lift? Such a great question, and is relatable to every one of us that are living without our child. I don't want anyone to walk away from today's episode feeling defeated, as if your grief is never going to get better. It will get better, but time is not the indicator of better. I'm going to say that again. Your grief will get better, but time is not the indicator of better. In fact, I believe time can be the enemy of grief. Time does not heal all wounds. It is what you do with your time that will decide if you learn to live in the tension of child loss. We spent a lot of time today discussing what we wished people knew about our grief. But the facts are that you cannot control what others think of your grief, your loss, how your child died. You cannot control any of that. Grief is as personal as your thumbprint. And because of that, only you can decide how you will live without your child on this earth. To answer the question, when does the surreal disbelief lift? I personally don't think it ever lifts. But the intensity of the disbelief lessens. By that I mean, when you process your grief in a healthy way, you will reach a place that allows you to live in that tension, knowing that you will likely never have all the answers, but you will be able to live again. It may not feel like that right now. And friend, if that is you, if I could just reach out and put my arms around you and tell you that you're going to make it, I would. It's a slow, gradual process that leads to a mindset shift. I'm going to say that again. It's a slow, gradual process that leads to a mindset shift of believing that your life is still worth living. It doesn't happen overnight. You might wake up one day and really feel good. I'm going to make it. And then grief revisits you because of something you see, something you hear, something someone says, or it's a special day or a holiday. That tension is never going to be completely relieved. But I want you to walk away today knowing I'm a few steps ahead of you. I'm 5 years into my grief journey. I remember it like it was yesterday. And there are times when my grief is so intense that all I can do is sit in my tears. But there's times in my life now where those moments don't last as long. And I'm able to get up and to be thankful for what I still have in my life. And I'm keeping my eyes on the prize. And that is the fact that I'm going to see my son again. That's what you have to look forward to. Does it ever go away? No. No, I would be lying to you if I told you that it's going to go away. It's never going to go away. But you can learn to live in the tension of child loss. That's why I'm here. I once heard an interview by Toby Mac after the death of his son, and I felt so confirmed by what he said. He expressed that someone had reached out to him that had lost a child, and he told Toby that to survive, you must start with finding the one thing that you can hold on to that gives you hope. I couldn't agree more. I call this an anchor, because living without your child is like trying to survive in a tornado. Okay, you're inside a tornado and you're being flipped upside down. You're being thrown from side to side and you're twirling out of control with no direction or sense of self. You have to find something to grab onto, to anchor you, to pull you out of the center of that tornado. The high winds will still blow. But when you have an anchor to hold onto, it keeps you steady. Doesn't mean that you won't feel the intensity of the wind, but it does mean that you will have the first step of learning to live in that storm. If you need help finding your anchor, visit my website at thegriefmentor.com Work With Me page and book your call. And that's all I have for you today. So until next time, take care. Did today's episode touch your heart? If it did, would you take a moment and leave a review on Apple Podcast? I read every single one. Scroll all the way down past all of the episodes till you come to a place where you can leave 5 stars. And would you go a step further and write a written review? It would mean the world to me if you did. Would you mind to share today's episode with somebody that you know that needs a ray of light in their grief journey? I would so appreciate it if you did. From my heart to yours.